Excited to have a multiple-time guest, Jack Galloway, one of our executive vice presidents with us here. He actually oversees the division that EntreLeadership resides within and is passionate about this brand. Jack, thanks for hanging out with us again.
Love to be here. Thank you.
I know we're having you back because you've done such a great job of laying out something that you have learned to do. It's been a process, trial, error, but now I think you would say confidently it is a tried and true process, and that is the difficult conversation, and we're talking about that on this episode. So I'm going to tee you up on what I'm calling the Galloway rules, because we've had you on before to talk about this. So you say rule number one, you got to deal with the very first difficult conversation. Many times in a process of going, as a leader, they're going, okay, I got to confront something. Yeah. The biggest hurdle is the first hurdle, which you say is that initial meeting. Two-part question here.
Sure.
Why is the first meeting the most difficult? And how do we get to that point so that when you got to have it, it's not as awkward as or difficult as we think it might be?
Ken, I've been here almost 18 years now in leadership, and anytime you're in leadership, you're going to deal one way or another with conflict. And the way I dealt with it for probably the first 10 years of my career here was maybe the conflict will just go away if I ignore it long enough. And it never went away. It always got worse. And over time, that feeling, I'm on the disc, I'm a high I, high C, I'm not a high D. I would start getting this nauseous feeling in my gut of how am I going to sit down and address this? And in the meantime, the conflict would get bigger and bigger, and my imagination would run away with me, and I would start losing sleep. And finally, we would sit down and have this very emotional conflict. And I finally learned that's just not the way to do it, but it's the way most of us do it, is we wait until it can't wait any longer. Today, what I do is the opposite. When there's a conflict to be dealt with, I deal with it early for two reasons. One is it's very small. It's easy to solve a conflict that's small. I can give a person benefit of the doubt. It doesn't feel like this magnificent thing that's been building over time. It just happened this morning. Let's just deal with it. The other is it doesn't give me time to get that feeling that keeps me up at night. I think about it. I know it needs to be dealt with. I sit down with the person and I address out loud, hey, can we talk about something that's a little uncomfortable? And we start working through conflict.
And the reality is that when you have that initial meeting, do you see a positive result quicker because of the result of doing it quickly?
Always. The reason is it also, because the conflict is smaller, the other person hadn't had a chance to go too far off the grid. The conflict just happened this morning. It's relatively small. I don't have to nail that person. I can course correct that person. I can talk through why that's a problem, and we can address how we're going to solve it. I can give them benefit of the doubt. It's much more of just a conversation. In fact, if I really do a good job, they may not realize we dealt with a conflict until the end of the conversation. As they're leaving, they may go, wow, we dealt with something pretty big there, but it didn't hurt like I thought it would.
Well, that's good. And one of the things you say is that difficult conversations that share truth build trust. So, okay, I'm hearing that, and I go, all right, how can a difficult conversation build trust?
Two ways. One is if you've got a team member that's outside of the accepted behavior of the team. You got a salesperson not making calls, and they're getting lazy, and they're doing things they're not supposed to be doing. The rest of the team picks up on that very quickly, and they're looking to you as the leader to go, do you have the backbone to deal with this? Or are you going to let that person not live up to the standard you've set for all of us? And so your team is watching. So it builds trust from the rest of the team when they know that you've dealt with something difficult in a kind way. It also builds trust with that team member because they trust that you've got the guts as a leader to invite them into your office, to sit down over a cup of coffee and say, hey, you're not at your best lately. What's going on? Your call volume's been in half. Your sales numbers are down. Your commissions are down. And start asking questions of the person as opposed to just hitting them with everything they're doing wrong. You say, it feels like there's a problem. Talk to me. What's going on? And oftentimes there is a problem, and the person will appreciate you asking them what's going on instead of telling them what's going on. But when they leave, it will build confidence that they go, my leader, my coach is confident enough to sit down with me when it's awkward and talk about things that matter.
Yeah, and they care. If they're truly a healthy person and it's handled right, don't they also walk out going, all right, they care enough. This wasn't about scolding me.
Yeah.
This is really about protecting me and allowing me to grow.
I always want to start with asking questions.
Yeah.
Here's what I've found with dealing with people for almost 20 years. Most of the people you encounter during the day are carrying around something heavy that's on the personal side of their life.
Right.
They've got a child that's sick. They've got a marriage that's in trouble. They are struggling financially. They've got a family member that's causing relational problems. They bring it to work. It affects their work. If you've got a salesperson who's been doing a good job for 8 years and all of a sudden they're not doing a good job, I want to give them benefit of the doubt and ask them what's going on. And oftentimes they'll confide in me when they've really not had the courage to confide in any other person, and I can help them walk through that situation while we figure out how to deal with the problem at hand.
And you find that most of the time this stuff they're carrying around obviously can be a direct source or an indirect source of the problem.
That's right.
Yeah, that's really good. All right. Now, I love a couple of these points here, and you've touched on one, but we're going to hit it again. But this first one, write it down. Now, when I remember the first time we talked about this on the show, I thought, well, that's interesting because I'm not wired that way.
Yeah.
But I do know that when you do write things down that are going to be difficult with maybe some potential emotion involved, it does several things positive. For me, I took away, now wait a second, that would keep me in the riverbanks. You do it for several reasons. Tell us the value for the leaders, what we're talking about now, Jack, that writing down the main points of this conflict that you've got to address, why it's so valuable to write it down.
I stumbled upon this method, this tool in your toolbox. This is something you may use once or twice a year. You don't have to do this every time. But I was very, very anxious in a conflict I was going to deal with. I had let it go on too long. It was with a longtime team member. We were friends as well as working together, and the conflict was weighing me down. And I was concerned that I would go in and do one of a couple of things that I don't want our leaders to do. One is build a court case. I'm anxious about this. You're a better arguer than I am. I'm the leader. And all of a sudden, I feel like I've got to win the conflict. I've got to build a case that traps you in the corner so you'll admit that, yes, there's a problem. And I don't want to do that as a leader. It puts you on the defensive. And so when I write it down, it keeps me on task. It keeps me in the riverbanks, as you put it. It keeps me from building a court case high or from going left or right off topic to something else you've been doing that bothered me 4 years ago that I'm just now bringing up, which takes away the credibility of the conflict that we're here to deal with. So it keeps me focused. And that one particular time, as awkward as it was, and I said it out loud. I said, hey, I know this is weird. I just don't know how else to get through this. I literally read it. Because in reading it, I was able to take thoughts that I had slept on the night before and articulate them in a way that kept me from getting too nervous or too harsh or exaggerating or being sarcastic, and it kept me on task. And do you know that conversation went beautifully because I was able to put it in a tone where the other person was able to hear it and receive it. And they knew that if I was uncomfortable as well, and I was, that it meant a lot. There was a lot at stake. And they needed to hear it from me that clearly and directly. And writing it down happened to be a way that helped me do that when I was early in dealing with my conflict and I was anxious.
I'm curious, did you find yourself in this particular story that you're recalling, did you find yourself after you initially read it, and now it's being received, obviously, you kind of go, thunk, hand it to them with that. Did you find yourself going back to that throughout the conversation?
At the end of the conversation, the hardest part of reading it was, what do you do when you get to the end?
Right, yeah.
And if you're a talker, you want to just keep talking to avoid the silence. And I would encourage our leaders, when they're dealing with conflict, let the silence lay. Let it be there and let the other person absorb it a little bit. Fight the temptation to just start talking again and let them respond. It may be 10 seconds of silence. It'll feel like hours, but let the seconds of silence go by and you'll get the most genuine, authentic, well thought out, least argumentative response from the person that you're talking to.
Good. All right. Now, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but I want to let you unpack this. And this is a great truth, and I think great hope and great freedom for leaders. And that is, it's not going to be as bad as you think it is. What we're saying here is, as leaders, when you got to confront something and deal with a difficult issue, it's not going to be as bad as you think in your mind. Right. We make it way worse. It's like this giant monster. Yeah. And then if we actually apply some of the things that you just laid out for us, all of the things, it's not that bad.
It's not. And the reason is, you begin to understand that conflict takes us to a better place. Where I'm on the Enneagram, I'm a 9. That's a peacemaker. I've tried other people's styles and it just comes across as weird for everybody. I've tried to be Dave Ramsey. I've tried to be other leaders and the person's just sitting there going, who are you? Now I just use my own style. Right. I'm very clear and direct, but I'm also very relational while I'm dealing with it. And today I don't get anxious about these conversations. I don't think about them the night before. I think about them while we're having the conversation. I listen intently to what the person says. I may take some notes. I may ask them afterward to send me some clarification on what they heard. But all of this comes very naturally. Part of which is due to the fact that I've jumped off that high dive maybe 100 times in the last 5 years. I've had over 100 difficult conversations with people of all personality types, and I've learned that if I will care about them and deal with a problem, almost every time the problem will be resolved, the relationship will be stronger, and they'll walk out a better leader or a better team member because I was willing to have this conversation with them. So I don't get anxious about it anymore. I feel like I'm helping.
Yeah. Well, and here's what I love about this conversation. Right from your mouth, you don't get anxious anymore because of 2 reasons. Yeah. You have a pattern, you have a process, if you will, that you have worked through, and you know it works for you. And we believe, Jack, that this is very transferable. I think as long as our leaders that are listening and watching do what you said, which is be you, use this process, adapt this process. But the process does take a lot of the anxiety away because you know it works if you stick to the plan.
That's right.
It's good stuff.
A couple other things I've learned to do is after the conflict. I've learned to do some things before the conflict and after. After the conflict, I've learned how important it is to swing by the person's desk and have a conversation same day about something not related to the conflict we just had, but about our normal workday. The reason is a team member, especially if they report to you, they walk out going, did I just lose all of the credibility I spent the last 10 years building? Did I just lose it in that moment? Do they really want me on the team at all? And when you come by and publicly hang out with them, talk about something unrelated to the conflict, it says a couple of things. One of the things it says to the team member is, it was really just about that thing. They don't dislike me. They just disliked the behavior that we were dealing with. I think we're okay outside of that. And it lets them relax. If you don't do that, until you have your first interaction with them, they will carry that around with them, wondering if they've really lost you and lost your respect. The other thing I've learned is before the conflict, all of these things assume that you've got a healthy relationship with a person, a peer, a leader, a team member, a family member, before you sit down and try to do these things. I spend a lot of time before conflicts investing into relationships throughout our company. Sometimes it's just a moment in a parking lot talking to a person as we pass for meetings about something that I think that they did well. Sometimes it's more of a sit down to work through a problem they really need my help with. But if I'll do that, when we finally sit down and deal with a conflict, we've got something to lean on. We were already had a good relationship, already friends, if you will, coming into this. Now I can sit down with you and say, Ken, I need to talk about something that's really awkward and uncomfortable. And you go, well, we've known each other for a long time. We were already good friends.
Right.
This can't be that bad compared to that.
Right.
And it's a big deal for you to invest before the conflict, during the conflict, and then quickly after the conflict.
Love it. Some great takeaways, several things. I think what you have modeled so well in this conversation is the power of questions. Leaders, I'm going to challenge you with that. When you ask a question of somebody, it has the least amount of impact to make them defensive. Because you're not making a declaratory statement, you're asking, and then at that point, they have to own that.
That's right.
Because you put the ball in their court.
That's right.
And I think it's a powerful thing.
Yeah.
And I've seen it modeled here very, very well. Jack Galloway, thank you, man. This is always good stuff. The value of difficult conversations is a process, folks, that works. And it works over and over and over again. Make it your own. Really good stuff. Jack, thanks for hanging out with us again.
Glad to be here.